So we've always said that the Mishnah in Yevamot is not really just defining the process of Yibum, of levirate marriage. I mean, it is doing that tangentially, but what it's really doing is kind of defining the boundaries of marriage itself. When we get onto the next tractate of Ketubot, we'll define really kind of proper behavior within a marriage. But here in Yevamot, we're defining the perimeters of a marriage. And as we jump into the 10th chapter, we're going to look at a situation where two marriages really don't exist. So a woman is married to two different men, and the halakha seems to treat both marriages as if they don't exist. They're invalid. Each one invalidates the other, and obviously with tragic consequences. And of course, the problem is a problem of information. I think there's a famous story about this, perhaps written by Agnon. But let's jump into the Mishnah, and then maybe let's jump into the Mishnah. So a woman whose husband has gone to a country beyond the sea. This is the classic case of lack of information. There's a parallel Mishnah in Gittin about someone who comes from a country beyond the sea. We don't know whether her get is valid or not. So in this case, the husband has gone to the country beyond the sea. We don't really know what's happening there. Communications are not like they are today. Ba'u ve'amrula mate ba'alai. They came and they told her, your husband died. Venisate, and so she remarried. Ve'achar kach ba ba'ala, and afterwards her husband returned. Gosh, so she's now married to these two men. What does the Mishnah recommend? Teitzei mizeh u'mizeh. She goes forth from both of them. Utzricha get mizeh u'mizeh. And she needs a get from both of them. And this is really interesting. If the marriages are invalid, why does she need a get? And there seems to be maybe there's a rabbinic issue here as well, that at least for the sake of appearances, she'd need to get, even though both marriages seem, well, we'll learn as the Mishnah goes on, both marriages are clearly invalid, and yet she still requires a get from both. How can we see that both marriages are invalid? Ein la ketubah. She doesn't get a ketubah from either man. Velo perot, and not the fruits, not essentially the income from her property that her husband operates during the marriage. Velo muzanot, he doesn't have to pay maintenance. Velo velayot, and he doesn't have to make up the depreciation. Doesn't have to essentially pay the depreciation on her clothes. Velo velayot al ze ve'al ze. He doesn't. None of these obligations are enforced from either husband. Even and if she's taken any of these sums from either husband, she has to give them back. And the child from either one of them is a mamzer. I think we can see why the child from the second marriage is a mamzer, because the second marriage is rendered invalid by the fact that the first husband's not dead. Why the child from a first marriage should be a mamzer is not quite clear, but the commentators invite us to consider the possibility that after her first husband came back, she went back to him. So in other words, after marrying the second husband, she goes back to the first. And then she has another baby by the first husband after her marriage to the second husband. And that's the situation in which the child from the first husband is a mamzer. Lo ze v'ze mitamin la. Neither of them impurifies himself for her. Now, if you're a Kohen, generally, you'd stay away from dead bodies. A Kohen doesn't come into contact with a dead body. But there's an exception in the case of the wife of a Kohen. The Kohen would render himself impure in order to bury his dead wife. But not in this particular case, because as we've seen, running down this list, essentially, this is a marriage which isn't a marriage. It's not a marriage. None of the normal links that apply to a marriage seem to apply. And we'll see this, we'll go through, let's just go through some more property rights. This Mishnah is very, very extensive. Essentially, it's detailing all the property rights and all the relationships which define a marriage. So we'll see as we go through this, essentially, we're defining the property relationships and other relationships in a marriage. So let's keep going. Neither of them is entitled to an object that she finds. So if a woman finds an object, according to classic halacha, that belongs to her husband. Velov maseyadeha, and the work of her hands doesn't belong to her husband, but it would if she were married. Velo hafer nadareha, and neither husband can annul her vows. Again, in a classic marriage relationship, the husband, if he hears the vow of a wife on the day that it's made, he can annul that vow. But this doesn't apply. If she was the daughter of an Israelite, she becomes disqualified from marrying a priest. We said before that someone who's become married in a forbidden relationship can't subsequently marry a priest. So that's the result of being in these two invalid marriages. Uvat Levi mina maaser. If she was the daughter of a Levi, she can't eat maaser anymore. She can't eat tithes anymore, because, again, her status is invalidated. Well, her status has invalidated her to take part in any holy act. It's very interesting if you step back and think about what is going on here. The woman in this situation receives a terrible punishment because she's completely financially cut off from all previous sources of support. Vat Levi mina maaser. If she's the daughter of a Levi, she can't eat maaser. Uvat Kohen mina truma. And if she's the daughter of a Kohen, she can't eat truma. Ein yorshav shel hazeh, ein yorshav shel hazeh v'yorshav shel hazeh yorshin ktubata. Neither one's heirs, in other words, neither of her male children, either by one husband or by the other husband, are entitled to inherit her ketubah. And they would normally be entitled to inherit her ketubah. Her ketubah is her property, and she can give it to her heirs. But in this case, well, we've said that both marriages are invalid, so the ketubah basically does not exist. So she doesn't have the ketubah. So clearly, if she doesn't have the ketubah, she can't pass it on. And if the brothers of either husband die, then she has to perform chalitza. She can't perform yibum. So that's the end of the first part of the Mishnah. And now there will be some dissenting opinions. And remember, we've always said, look, the Mishnah preserves dissenting opinions. Rabbi Yossi Omer, K'tubatal nichsei bala harishon. Rabbi Yossi seems to believe that the first marriage is essentially valid, because he says her ketubah remains a charge on the estate of her first husband, i.e., she can have the ketubah from her first husband when her first husband gives her the get. So Rabbi Yossi seems to recognize the first marriage, whereas the plain Mishnah seems to take the view that both marriages in some way have become invalid. They both annul each other. Rabbi Elazar Omer Harishon Zakad Miutzata Uvmaseh Adeha Uvahafer Nedareha. Rabbi Elazar said, look, the first one is essentially gets economic benefits, is entitled to an object that she finds and to the work of her hands and can annul her vows. So Rabbi Elazar, like Rabbi Yossi, seems to recognize the validity of the first marriage. Rabbi Shimon Omer, Rabbi Shimon said, look, a sexual relationship or a chalitza with the brother of the first husband. So now we're assuming that the first husband has really died. I think we're assuming he has really died. A sexual relationship, so in other words, she can perform yibum with the brother of the first husband. And then, of course, any of her rivals are exempt, and that child is not a mamzer. And then the Mishnah concludes with an observation that really is connected to the following Mishnah, the second Mishnah going forward. So maybe I'll scroll forward again. We'll try and read this final sentence in the Mishnah, the first Mishnah of chapter 10, with the second Mishnah. And the end of the first Mishnah reads, if she married without an authorization, in other words, if she married the second husband without an authorization from a bet din, muteret lachzor lo, she can go back to him, as if she's taken initiative. Perhaps the second marriage really doesn't exist, and she can go back to the first marriage. That's how the first Mishnah concludes. And then the Mishnah goes on to say, the opposite case, Niseit al pi beit din, if she married with the authorization of the court. So she's asked the court whether she can marry. Maybe, news has come from abroad that her first husband died. She consults the beit din. She marries with the authorization of the court, and somehow this puts her in a worse situation than if she married without authorization. Tate say she has to be divorced, but ufteruha minha korban, but she's exempt from bringing a sacrifice. The bet din seems to take upon itself the responsibility for the sin offering that would otherwise be required. And the Mishnah explains, if she married without the authorization of the court, she must be divorced, but she's liable for a sacrifice. And maybe this part of the Mishnah doesn't match perfectly with the end of the previous Mishnah, which says she can go back. So maybe she is divorced from, if we marry together the two Mishnayot, maybe she's divorced from the second one and brings a korban, but she can go back to the first one. Ipei kochan shel beit din. So the authority of the bet din, the authority of the court is greater. Shepatruha minar korban, because it exempts her from a sacrifice. It's very interesting that in other words, the bet din can exempt her effectively from a biblical obligation to bring the korban. What if the court ruled that she could be married, and she went, and the Mishnah says that kilkala is to, it's really to mess. It's hard to translate. I've translated here on the source sheet as messed up. They gave her permission to remarry, but she just went and did something. She just went and did something wrong. And the intention here is that she entered a forbidden relationship. So maybe she's a widow now. Maybe she married a Kohen Gadol, right? A widow can't marry a Kohen Gadol. So she entered into a forbidden relationship. Chayevet ba korban. She has to bring a sacrifice. Shelo hitiruha ela lehinaseh, because the court only permitted her to marry. And the Mishnah, when it says permitted her to marry, I think the Mishnah is saying the court, when it gave her permission to marry, gave her permission to marry in a legal relationship. So there are certain boundaries. It permitted her to marry, but in a legal relationship. It didn't permit her to marry just anybody.